Welcome back to U.S. Farm Report. Well, we focused a lot on the supply side of the equation in the first roundtable. So now let's look at demand. Some fairly good news on the demand front from China this week when we got some export numbers. Soybeans pretty good, on the meats too. But Chad, when you look at soybeans versus corn, do you think that the pace can continue with soybeans? And are you worried about corn at this point?
I'm worried about corn at this point. Beans, yeah, we're up now about 10% year over year. Corn's down by 50%. So we've seen a dramatic pullback, especially from China. And we're not getting a lot of chatter that way that we're going to see additional growth there. We are getting some from places like Taiwan, Mexico, but China would be the big one as far as pushing us to better levels as we look out at the corn market.
Does it surprise you a little bit just based on the global grain situation and the thought that we would see some folks come to the U.S. maybe to fulfill some of those needs? I mean, we know soybeans, we're going to have some stiff competition from places like South America, but does the corn situation right now on the export side surprise you a little bit?
A little bit, not a lot. And it goes back to when you think about the corn wheat sort of debate worldwide. We have seen the wheat numbers overall globally rising over the past few months. That's taking some of the pressure off of the corn market when it comes to exports.
I know it's really early to talk about acreage, and I'm not going to get into it much, but when you look at some of the rain that we saw in the Southern Plains specifically, Texas, hearing some of that wheat seed that they planted, maybe sprouting a little bit, cotton prices aren't doing very good right now compared to some of the other commodities. So is it possible that we are gaining some wheat acres and things as we speak?
Yeah, I think we will see some gain in those wheat acres, especially as we do look at the Southern Plains. We also saw some recovery in the Northern Plains as well this past year. So when you think about spring wheat up there, we saw a little bump that way. Wheat is gaining as we look out there, and a lot of that is tied to what's happening with the war in Ukraine.
Well, I know even, this spring when we were talking about a possible recession, that really the meat sector was what was of most concern by a lot of economists, Lee. So, is that kind of already baked into prices right now? We're hearing that recession word a little bit more this week as we look at the Fed's announcement, or do you think that could be a wet blanket on the livestock markets in the coming months?
I think we're cautiously optimistic as we look at how demand has been so far, and you could speak domestically or on the export market. I think it's held up. Right now, when you compare beef and pork, there's some obvious differences there. But I think when you compare those two meats, we were starting at a bit different place. And so I think that's important to put into those contexts. Going forward, it's really going to be about how much higher prices we can push off to those consumers, both exports as well as domestic. Supplies are tightening, so it's all about, are we going to see enough higher prices to hold that value and keep the pie where it's at?
Is there any indication that we will see demand wane a bit? I mean, when you look at the CPI, you look at those meat numbers, they're not coming down. The price is still up. It looks like consumers are willing to pay for that, but how long can that last, especially as you get closer to that Christmas time frame?
I think we're starting to see a few chinks in the armor, possibly. I think it's too early to say, we're going to see a downturn in demand, but we haven't seen the appreciation we've seen the last several quarters. And so when I look at what we've seen in the first quarter of 2022 compared to the second quarter of 2022, we were a lot more optimistic early in the year than we are now. So I think we may see some of those factors weighing on demand of consumers. I want to point out exports too. We got to go back to remembering that currency really matters. And that I think is a big concern as we look at South Korea, Japan, and their currency relative to the US dollar. I think there's some big implications there possibly for exports, and we're starting to see some of that play out in the data as well.
We've been talking about the situation in Ukraine since it happened, in that February and then into that March timeframe about what possibly could happen to production in Ukraine. Are you more concerned, though, about 2023's crop than you were 2022?
Possibly, and I'm going to phrase it this way. What we figured out over the course of the past 6 months is, one, Ukrainian farmers are amazing in the ability to plant within a war zone, but two, they've been able to move that crop out of the country as well. And so the big key as we're looking forward over the next 6 months is the trade deal that Ukraine and Russia reached with the UN. Does that continue to hold? Because if it does, we'll continue to see some crop at least come out of the Ukraine.
But what do signs point to right now when it comes to that trade deal, when we know that Putin has been vocal lately about that?
He's been vocal, but he hasn't done anything about it yet, which is surprising to me yet, because normally he likes to follow up his language with a little action. We haven't seen any action yet.
All right. Well, I appreciate you both being here, Chad, Lee. Thank you so much for joining us from Iowa State. We need to take a quick break, and then we'll have much more right here on U.S. Farm Report.